Have you ever wondered why the person who pushed you away, who said they needed space, who acted so certain about ending it, is the same person who later can't seem to forget you? Why the one who rejected you is suddenly the one remembering, missing, and quietly replaying everything? This isn't about ego. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about proving your worth. It's about something much deeper that most people never talk about. Avoidants don't always miss you immediately. In fact, at first they feel relief, but what they feel later, that's where the truth lives. And if you were the empath in that relationship, this message is going to feel personal. At the beginning of the breakup, they looked calm, maybe even cold. While you were breaking inside, they seemed composed, logical, certain. They told themselves they made the right decision. They convinced themselves that the relationship was too intense, too emotional, too demanding. What they were really saying was that it felt too close. Intimacy for them doesn't feel like safety, it feels like exposure. So when they walked away, what they experienced first wasn't grief. It was space, silence, a sense of regained control. And that illusion of freedom feels powerful in the beginning. No more deep emotional conversations. No more feeling responsible for someone else's feelings. No more vulnerability pulling at wounds they've spent years trying to avoid. It feels lighter, easier. They can breathe again. They tell themselves, this is better, this is what I needed. And while you're questioning your worth, they're enjoying the quiet. But here's what they don't expect. Freedom without connection eventually feels empty. At first, the silence is peaceful. Then it becomes loud. The nights stretch longer. The distractions don't distract the same way. The people around them feel surface level. Conversations feel thinner. And slowly, almost quietly, something uncomfortable begins to creep in. It's not dramatic. It doesn't hit all at once. It's subtle. A memory while driving. A song that reminds them of you. The way you used to look at them when they felt misunderstood by the world. They start realizing that what they called pressure was actually emotional depth. What they labeled too much was actually someone caring enough to stay present. And what they thought was restriction was actually connection. That's when the illusion begins to crack. Because space is only liberating when you don't feel alone. And eventually they do. You see, when an avoidant leaves an empath, they're not just leaving a partner. They're leaving the person who emotionally regulated them in ways they didn't even consciously recognize. You were the one who sensed their mood shifts before they spoke. The one who softened your tone when they were overwhelmed. The one who gave reassurance without being asked. You learned their silence. You read between their pauses. You absorbed their emotional storms so they didn't have to fully face them. They may have called you intense, but what you really were was safe. Empaths have a quiet gift. They create emotional environments where people can land, where someone can fall apart without being judged, where vulnerability is met with warmth instead of criticism. And for someone who grew up believing closeness equals danger, that kind of safety is unfamiliar, uncomfortable, even suspicious. So they push it away. But once it's gone, they feel the difference immediately. Because suddenly, no one is anticipating their needs. No one is adjusting gently to their triggers. No one is holding emotional space without keeping score. They enter new interactions thinking it will feel the same. It doesn't. Other people require clear communication. They expect openness. They don't automatically decode silence. And that feels exhausting to someone who struggles to articulate emotions in the first place. With you, they didn't have to explain everything. You just knew. And now in your absence, they realize how rare that was. They start missing the way you would sit quietly beside them when they were overwhelmed, the way you'd send a thoughtful message after sensing something was off, the way you reassured them without making them feel weak. They miss being understood without having to expose themselves. But here's the part that stings. Their ego doesn't let them admit this right away. Avoidants survive by intellectualizing feelings. They tell themselves stories that protect them from vulnerability. It wouldn't have worked anyway. We were too different. I need someone less emotional. These narratives feel safe. They protect the identity they've built around independence. But the heart doesn't follow logic forever. Eventually, the emotional body catches up. And when it does, it doesn't ask politely. Memories begin to feel heavier. They start replaying small moments, the way you laughed, the way you celebrated their wins, the way you saw potential in them when they doubted themselves. They remember how you believed in them, how you stayed patient even when they pulled away, how you loved them in a way that didn't require them to perform. that's when regret begins to whisper. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Because deep down, they know they didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because it felt too real, too close, too exposing, and it's easier to abandon connection than to confront the fear of being truly seen. And now the silence you once feared, it's the silence they can't escape. There's another layer to this that most people overlook. Avoidants expect to be chased, not consciously, but subconsciously. They are used to partners fighting to stay, proving their devotion, trying harder. It reinforces their sense of value while keeping emotional distance intact. As long as someone is pursuing them, they don't have to fully lean in. But empaths reach a breaking point. And when an empath stops chasing, something shifts. When you finally decided to choose yourself, when you stopped sending long emotional messages, when you stopped trying to fix what they wouldn't face, that's when the dynamic changed. Your silence wasn't dramatic, it was dignified, and that dignity is what unsettles them the most. Because now there's no reassurance, no emotional supply, no proof that you're still waiting. Scarcity creates reflection. They begin wondering if you've moved on, if someone else is experiencing the softness they once had access to, if someone else is being understood the way they were. And that thought doesn't feel freeing, it feels destabilizing. For the first time, they feel replaceable. And avoidants struggle deeply with that feeling. They may not show it, they may not reach out immediately, but internally, something shifts. The certainty they once had begins to dissolve. Doubt creeps in, they start comparing new connections to the depth they had with you. Surface level attraction feels hollow. Casual conversations feel unfulfilling. Emotional distance, which once felt safe, now feels isolating. Because what they truly miss isn't drama, it isn't intensity, it's the way you made them feel seen without pressure, accepted without conditions, chosen without manipulation. And here's the truth that hurts but empowers at the same time. They often realize your value when you're no longer accessible. Not because you changed, but because you stopped overextending. You stopped trying to prove your worth to someone who couldn't hold it. And in doing so, you reclaimed your power. Avoidants miss the empath X. They once rejected because the empath offered something rare, emotional depth without control, love without games, presence without force. And when that disappears, it leaves a void they didn't anticipate. If you're listening to this and you were the one left behind, I want you to understand something deeply. Their delayed realization is not validation of your pain. It's confirmation of your value. The reason they miss you isn't because you were perfect. It's because you were real. And real connection is irreplaceable. You may have felt like you were too much, too emotional, too sensitive. But sensitivity is what created intimacy. Your depth was never the problem. Their fear of it was. And the irony is this: the very vulnerability they ran from becomes the thing they search for later. But by then, you're no longer the same person. Because pain transforms empaths. It forces growth. It teaches boundaries. It teaches discernment. And when you finally detach, you don't do it halfway. You don't leave the door slightly open. You close it gently but completely. That finality is what echoes in their mind. Not because they lost control, but because they lost connection. And connection, once experienced at that depth, is unforgettable. So if you're healing right now, if you're questioning whether they ever cared, if you're wondering why they seem fine while you're still processing, remember this: some people feel later what you felt immediately. Some hearts are slower to wake up, but when they do, they remember exactly who made them feel safe. And sometimes missing you becomes the lesson they needed, not to win you back, but to finally understand what they once rejected. The realization doesn't feel empowering. It feels heavy, because now they have to sit with something they've avoided their entire life: grief. Avoidants don't process loss the way you do. When the breakup first happened, you probably felt everything at once: the ache, the confusion, the longing, the tears that came without permission. You didn't suppress it, you couldn't. Your heart opens first and protects later. But they function differently. When the relationship ended, they compartmentalized. They folded the memories neatly into a box labeled past and slid it onto a mental shelf. They distracted themselves. Work, friends, routines, maybe even someone new. Anything to avoid feeling the depth of what just ended. But emotions don't disappear just because they're postponed. They wait. And months later, sometimes when life finally slows down, the box falls off the shelf. It happens unexpectedly. A quiet night, a moment of vulnerability, a failure that reminds them of how you used to encourage them. Suddenly, the grief they skipped comes rushing in. And it's confusing because by now they've told themselves they moved on. They've convinced others they're fine. Yet here they are, thinking about you in a way that feels almost intrusive. This is the delayed grief of someone who runs from intimacy. They don't miss you in the beginning because their defense system is activated. But once their nervous system calms down and the threat of closeness is gone, the emotional truth surfaces, and it hits harder because they didn't prepare for it. They start remembering your patience, the way you stayed calm when they withdrew, the way you tried to understand instead of accuse, the way you reached for connection instead of control. And for the first time, they see the breakup not as something they escaped, but something they lost. There's another layer that makes this realization even more intense. You didn't stay the same. While they were avoiding their emotions, you were facing yours. While they were distracting themselves, you were healing. And pain, when faced honestly, transforms people. At first, you may have blamed yourself, wondered if you were too sensitive, too available, too understanding. But slowly, something shifted inside you. You began redirecting the love you poured into them, back into yourself. You stopped waiting for their validation. You started building boundaries. You stopped chasing. And that transformation, it radiates. When they see you months later, maybe through social media, mutual friends, or a chance encounter, they notice something different. It's subtle, but undeniable. You're calmer, stronger, less reactive. You don't look like someone who's waiting anymore. That's when the panic begins. Because now it's not just about missing you, it's about realizing you've evolved beyond the version of yourself they once had access to. Avoidants often feel safest when they believe they can return whenever they choose. Not because they consciously plan to, but because it comforts them to know the door might still be open. When they sense that the door has truly closed, when they feel your emotional detachment, it destabilizes them. Scarcity changes perception. Suddenly, your absence isn't temporary. It feels permanent. And permanence triggers reflection. They begin comparing every new interaction to what they had with you. The chemistry might be there with someone else, the attraction might be strong, but something feels missing. Depth, emotional resonance, that unspoken understanding that didn't require performance. With you, they didn't have to impress constantly. They could just exist. And that kind of acceptance is rare. New connections often require vulnerability, clear communication, emotional reciprocity. And for someone who struggles with expressing feelings that feels overwhelming, they might find themselves withdrawing again, pulling away, repeating patterns, and that's when the realization deepens. It wasn't that you were too much, it's that you were meeting them at a depth they weren't ready to sustain. They start seeing how you tried to build something secure, how you asked for reassurance not to control them, but to feel safe, how your emotional intensity wasn't chaos, it was care. And slowly the narrative they created about you begins to dissolve. You weren't needy. You were attached. You weren't dramatic. You were invested. You weren't overwhelming. You were open. That shift in perspective is painful because it requires accountability. It forces them to acknowledge that what they labeled as flaws in you were actually reflections of their own discomfort with intimacy. And here's the part that lingers in their mind the longest. You saw them. Not the polished version they show the world, not the independent, emotionally detached exterior. You saw the fear underneath, the insecurity they mask with confidence, the longing for connection they pretend they don't have. You saw it, and you didn't judge it. You stayed. And that kind of acceptance leaves an imprint. Avoidants may reject vulnerability in the moment, but they crave it in the long run. They want someone who sees beyond their defenses, someone who doesn't run when they shut down, someone who understands their silence without interpreting it as rejection. You did that. And when they try to recreate that dynamic with someone new, they realize how rare it is. Because not everyone has the patience of an empath. Not everyone will gently ask, "What's wrong?" instead of assuming the worst. Not everyone will hold space during emotional distance without taking it personally. They start to recognize that your love wasn't ordinary. It was intentional. And now that they're sitting with that awareness, they feel something unfamiliar, remorse, not necessarily loud apologies or dramatic declarations. Avoidants rarely express regret openly, but internally there's a quiet acknowledgement. I might have let something valuable go. And what makes it heavier is this: they miss not just you, but who they were with you. Around you, they softened, even if only slightly. They laughed more freely. They shared parts of themselves they don't usually reveal. You created an environment where they could be less guarded, and losing you means losing that version of themselves. That realization is profound, because now they're not just grieving a relationship, they're grieving potential, the life you were building, the emotional growth they were slowly stepping into before fear interrupted it. They may never articulate this clearly, but it lingers in quiet moments. They remember the nights you stayed up talking about the future, the comfort of your presence during stressful times, the way you looked at them as if they were capable of becoming more. You believed in them, and belief is powerful. When someone sees your potential and loves you in alignment with it, it challenges you to grow, but growth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability triggers fear. So they ran. But distance creates clarity, and clarity often comes with longing. If you're listening right now, wondering if they ever think about you, understand this. Missing someone doesn't always look like reaching out. Sometimes it looks like silent comparison, like checking your profile and saying nothing, like starting conversations with others but feeling disconnected halfway through. Sometimes it looks like remembering your voice during moments of stress. Sometimes it looks like wishing they had handled things differently. But here's what matters most. Their realization does not require your return. You don't have to go back for their lesson to be complete. You don't have to reopen your heart for them to understand its value, because your role in their life may have been to show them what depth feels like, even if they weren't ready to hold it. And your role in your own life is to continue evolving. The truth is, avoidants miss the empathics they once rejected because empaths offer something irreplaceable: emotional intimacy without manipulation, love without games, presence without conditions. When that disappears, it forces reflection. But reflection doesn't always equal reconciliation. Sometimes it simply becomes a quiet chapter in their story, the one where they learned too late what real connection felt like. And as you continue healing, growing, and strengthening your boundaries, remember this: being missed is not the same as being chosen. And you deserve someone who doesn't have to lose you to understand your worth. Because here's the part that most people never say out loud. When avoidants start missing the empath they rejected, it's not always about love in the romantic sense. Sometimes it's about emotional contrast. When you were in their life, they had depth available to them every day, conversations that went beneath the surface, emotional safety they didn't have to earn, a presence that felt grounding without being controlling. They didn't value it because it was consistent, it was always there. But after you're gone, they enter a world of emotional minimalism. Conversations feel transactional. Attraction feels physical, but not soulful. Attention feels temporary. They might date someone exciting, someone independent, someone who doesn't ask for much emotionally. At first, that feels easier. There's less pressure, less intensity. But ease is not the same as intimacy. And over time, something starts to feel. They laugh, but it doesn't linger. They talk, but it doesn't deepen. They connect, but it doesn't root. And that's when the comparison begins quietly in their mind. You were different. Not because you were perfect, but because you were emotionally available. You asked real questions. You listened without waiting for your turn to speak. You noticed when their energy shifted. You created emotional gravity, the kind that makes a connection feel meaningful rather than convenient. And now, surrounded by lighter interactions, they begin to miss the weight of something real. Avoidants often mistake calm for connection and independence for compatibility, but what they eventually realize is that emotional distance may feel safe, but it doesn't feel fulfilling. And fulfillment is something the body remembers. They might not consciously say, "I miss the empath," but they feel it when conversations don't reach their heart. They feel it when nobody understands their silence. They feel it when no one challenges them to grow. Because you didn't just love them, you mirrored them. You reflected their fears gently. You pointed out their patterns without attacking. You encouraged vulnerability without forcing it. That kind of mirroring is uncomfortable at first. It feels exposing, but it's also transformational. And once you're gone, that mirror disappears. They can go back to being emotionally self-contained, back to not digging deeper, back to staying guarded. But growth that was once initiated doesn't fully reverse. Some part of them now knows what deeper connection feels like. And that awareness lingers. They might try to recreate it. They might try to find someone else who feels similar. But emotional depth isn't a template you can copy. It's co-created. It was built through shared moments, shared vulnerability, shared patience. It was built with you. And that uniqueness is what makes it irreplaceable. There's also something else they begin to miss: your patience. Empaths have a remarkable ability to hold space for imperfection. You didn't expect them to be flawless. You understood their wounds. You tried to navigate their distance without immediately personalizing it. You gave them room to breathe while still reaching for connection. Most people won't do that. Most people won't tolerate inconsistency for long. They won't analyze withdrawal as fear. They'll interpret it as disinterest. They won't gently wait for emotional expression. They'll demand it or walk away. So when avoidants encounter partners who respond differently to their shutdowns, it shocks them. Suddenly, their withdrawal creates real consequences. Their silence creates real distance. Their emotional unavailability isn't absorbed, it's mirrored back, and they start realizing how much grace you extended. You didn't leave the first time they pulled away. You didn't match their coldness with cruelty. You tried to understand before reacting. That level of emotional maturity is rare, and rare things become valuable when they're no longer accessible. But here's where it becomes even deeper. They miss being chosen daily. You chose them in small ways they barely acknowledged at the time. The good morning messages, the check-ins, the reassurance, the subtle loyalty in how you spoke about them to others, the way you celebrated their wins like they were your own. Consistency doesn't always feel exciting in the moment, but it creates security. And security is something avoidants crave without admitting it. When they no longer have someone consistently choosing them, they feel the instability. They may tell themselves they prefer independence, but human connection is wired into us. Being emotionally selected, not chased, not possessed, but genuinely chosen, creates grounding. You chose them, even when it wasn't easy. And once that choice is removed, they feel the absence of it. There's another quiet truth here. Time changes memory. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup, they focus on what felt overwhelming, the conflicts, the intensity, the moments that triggered their fear. But as months pass, emotional memory softens the edges of those experiences. The arguments feel smaller, the intimacy feels warmer, the laughter feels brighter. Time filters pain, but preserves connection. And as the emotional fog clears, they begin remembering you with more clarity, not as someone who demanded too much, but as someone who cared deeply, not as someone who was overwhelming, but as someone who was emotionally invested. And with that clarity comes a new kind of regret, not dramatic, not desperate, but reflective. I should have handled that differently. I was afraid. I pushed away something good. They may never say these words to you, but internally they echo. And here's something that's rarely acknowledged. Avoidants don't just miss the person, they miss the nervous system experience. When you were around, their body slowly adapted to closeness, even if it felt uncomfortable at times. There were moments of calm, moments when their guard lowered, moments when they felt understood without threat. The body registers that safety, and when it's gone, the contrast becomes noticeable. New interactions may feel stimulating, even exciting, but excitement is not the same as emotional safety. Safety feels steady, predictable, warm. Your presence offered that. And the body remembers warmth long after the mind rationalizes distance. But this doesn't mean they will always return. Missing someone doesn't automatically create courage. Sometimes it just creates awareness. And awareness can be painful when it arrives too late. If you're listening to this, still healing, still processing, I want you to hear this part carefully. Their eventual realization does not invalidate your pain. You experienced the loss immediately. You didn't delay it. You faced it. You sat with it. You cried through it. You questioned yourself. You rebuilt yourself. They may feel it later, but that doesn't mean you were wrong for feeling it first. It simply means you were emotionally open. And openness is strength, not weakness. You didn't lose because you loved deeply. You loved deeply because that's who you are. And the reason avoidants miss the empath X they once rejected is not because empaths are flawless. It's because empaths bring emotional depth that exposes avoidance. They bring presence that challenges detachment. They bring intimacy that requires growth. And growth is uncomfortable. But once someone has tasted emotional depth, surface level connection rarely satisfies in the same way. So they remember, they reflect, they miss. Sometimes quietly, sometimes intensely, sometimes too late. And while they're processing their delayed grief, you are evolving. You are learning that love does not require self-abandonment, that patience does not mean tolerating inconsistency forever, that empathy does not mean enduring emotional neglect. You are discovering boundaries. And boundaries change everything. Because the next time someone enters your life, they won't be met with overextension. They'll be met with balance. They'll be met with depth, but also standards. And that's the version of you that doesn't get rejected. That's the version of you that gets reciprocated. So if they miss you, let them. If they realize your value, let them. But never shrink yourself again to make someone else comfortable with their fear. Because the truth is simple and powerful. You are not too much. You are emotionally available in a world that often isn't. And one day someone will meet that depth without running from it. Until then, understand this. Sometimes the greatest validation isn't them coming back. It's you outgrowing the need for them to. Because at the deepest level, what they miss isn't just your presence, it's the version of themselves that only existed when they were with you. Around you, something softened in them, even if they resisted it, even if they fought it. There were moments, quiet, almost invisible moments when they let their guard down, when their voice got gentler, when their eyes held vulnerability instead of distance, when they admitted fears they don't normally speak out loud. You saw that version, and you treated it with care. That's not something they experience often. Most people only get their armored self, the composed self, the independent self, the emotionally controlled self. But you reached beneath that. You connected with the part of them that wanted closeness but didn't know how to hold it. When they lost you, they didn't just lose a relationship, they lost access to that softer identity. And that's what lingers. Because once someone experiences themselves in a more open way, even briefly, it leaves an imprint. They can return to old habits, they can rebuild their walls, but somewhere inside, they know there was another way to exist. With you, they were challenged to grow, not through force, but through love. And love that invites growth is rare. At first, they may have framed your emotional depth as pressure. They may have interpreted your desire for reassurance as neediness. They may have labeled your consistency as intensity. But as time passes, those labels lose their power. What remains is clarity. You weren't trying to control them. You were trying to connect. You weren't demanding perfection. You were asking for presence. You weren't overwhelming. You were invested. And when they finally sit with that truth, the regret becomes more specific. They begin replaying moments where they withdrew instead of communicating, moments where they chose silence instead of honesty, moments where they sensed your hurt but didn't know how to step toward it. They start imagining how things could have unfolded differently if they had responded instead of retreated, if they had leaned in instead of pulling away, if they had trusted instead of guarded. But growth after loss often comes with a bittersweet edge, because by the time they reach that awareness, you're not waiting in the same way anymore. You've changed. Pain reshaped you. The nights you cried alone strengthened something inside you. The unanswered messages taught you self-respect. The moments you felt abandoned forced you to anchor yourself instead of clinging to someone else. You stopped trying to decode mixed signals. You stopped romanticizing inconsistency. You stopped making excuses for emotional distance. And in doing so, you became grounded. That grounded energy is powerful. When they sense it, even from afar, it unsettles them. Because now, if they were to return, it wouldn't be to the same dynamic. It wouldn't be to someone overextending to keep them comfortable. It would be to someone who expects reciprocity. And reciprocity requires vulnerability. That's the crossroad they face. Missing you is easy. Becoming emotionally available enough to hold you is harder. Some avoidants rise to that challenge. They confront their fear. They seek growth. They learn to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it. But others remain in the cycle, longing without acting, reflecting without changing. And this is where your power lies. You are no longer defined by whether they choose growth. You are defined by your own. The reason avoidants miss the empath X they once rejected goes beyond simple nostalgia. It's layered, psychological, emotional, nervous system deep. You represented safety and depth at the same time, a combination that felt foreign but healing. You were a mirror, and mirrors are confronting. When someone sees themselves clearly, their wounds, their defenses, their potential, it can either inspire growth or trigger escape. They chose escape then. But distance removes the immediate discomfort of reflection. It also removes the warmth that came with it. So now they're left with contrast. Connections that feel lighter but less meaningful. Freedom that feels spacious but less intimate. Silence that feels peaceful but less alive. And in that contrast, your memory sharpens. They remember the way you celebrated their smallest achievements, the way you reassured them when they doubted themselves, the way you held their hand a little tighter when you sensed they were spiraling internally. They remember feeling chosen, not chased, not controlled, chosen. And being chosen by someone who sees you fully is transformative. That's why it's unforgettable. But here's the truth that matters most to you. Their missing you does not mean you were meant to go back. Sometimes you enter someone's life as a catalyst, as a lesson, as the person who shows them what real emotional intimacy feels like. You awaken something in them, even if they aren't ready to sustain it, and sometimes that awakening only fully registers after you're gone. If you're still carrying questions, wondering if they ever cared, if they ever look back, if they ever regret, understand this: people don't forget the ones who made them feel safe enough to soften. They may suppress it, they may deny it, they may distract themselves from it, but they don't erase it. The body remembers, the heart remembers, even if the ego resists it. And while they're remembering, you are rebuilding. You're learning that love should feel mutual. That reassurance shouldn't feel like begging. That emotional availability shouldn't feel like imbalance. You're realizing that depth is not something to dilute for someone else's comfort. And one day, you will meet someone who doesn't flinch at your emotional openness. Someone who doesn't interpret closeness as threat. Someone who sees your empathy as strength. And when that happens, you'll understand something profound. The pain you felt was not punishment. It was preparation. Preparation for a love that doesn't require you to prove your worth. Preparation for a connection where vulnerability is met with vulnerability. Preparation for being chosen as deeply as you choose. So yes, avoidants miss the empath X they once rejected. They miss the warmth. They miss the understanding. They miss the softness. They miss the depth. They miss the version of themselves that felt more open in your presence. But your story doesn't end with being missed. It continues with being valued. And there is a difference. Being missed is about absence. Being valued is about presence. You deserve presence. You deserve someone who doesn't need to lose you to see you. And as you move forward, stronger, wiser, more grounded, remember this: you were never too much. You were a glimpse of what real emotional intimacy feels like. And the right person won't run from that. They'll rise to meet it.